Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm glad to see you here on such a sunny day when there's so many nice things you might be thinking of. It's great to see that despite our being very advanced in the semester, there is still an appetite for discussion. It's fair to say that there are quite a few things happening in today's world. Each time we turn on the TV or read our daily newspaper, one can but be struck by the avalanche of dramatic news. And well, it's good to have opportunities to discuss them. I must confess that when Nathalie and I, back now in the summer of 2024, planned this seminar series on transatlantic relations, we did not expect, of course, that we knew that we expected there to be movement, yes, and movement there has been in so many directions. But little did we know, of course, that the discussion we thought we should have at some stage on the economic dimension would take place just days after one of the most dramatic announcements made by the new administration. And I've read, I think it was Larry Summers who said it's the most dramatic decision ever made by a US president in the field of economic policy, or something like that. I'm not an economist, so I can't judge, but it certainly suggests that it's worth being discussed. And indeed, there is no shortage of questions to be asked, questions about, let's say, the underlying rationality of the tariffs program announced by President Trump. What exactly is that meant to be? Is it a way to, create bargaining chips in forthcoming discussions with the rest of the world? Or is there an underlying vision of the way the new world trade order should look like? If there is, what is this hidden rationality? What's the trade of the order of tomorrow if we are to live with the high tariffs which have been decided by President Trump? The second question is one of impact. What kind of impact will this have on the economy? And of course, I'm sure that, like me, you've seen that there are quite a number of gloomy assessments of the harm that will be inflicted on the world economy. But let's say it varies considerably from one part of the world to the other. And is it something that's going to stay, or is it something that we can expect to see being eroded by future events? Normally, if I remember well, it is said that when you decide you adopt tariffs, you create a mechanism of path dependency that make it more difficult to withdraw them or to lower them than to create them. But is it really the case? And thirdly, since we are talking about transatlantic relationship, what can the EU do in response to what has been announced? What should it do? And as you know, there is a big debate ongoing at the European level, with people arguing for retaliation and people saying, well, let the Americans harm themselves if they wish, and maybe they will return to reason after a while. So there's a lot that we have on our plate. To introduce the discussion tonight, we have the pleasure and privilege of having two two speakers who are well known in-house. I will start by my predecessor, Mike Plummer, who is the Eni Professor of International Economics and has some interest in the kind of issues that we're going to discuss tonight, let's say. And Nathalie Tocci, as you will by now know, is currently the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali and a well-known expert in international relations with whom we've had the pleasure of collaborating in the organization of this seminar. We were to be joined by a third person who let us down early this afternoon. So the name will not be mentioned.
We'll put on a tariff next time.
Exactly.
We'll think of some kind of tariff indeed. But I'm not worried. I know that precisely because this, the issues are manifold and let's say, interrelated in multiple ways. There is no shortage of points to be discussed, and maybe precisely as a result of being fewer, there will be more time for discussion, which is very good. So having said this, I will, without further ado, kick off the discussion and turn perhaps to Michael. To
me first?
Yes, I think so. It's
good. Well, anyway. Reagan warned against demagogues who declare a trade war against our friends while cynically waving the American flag. But even before that, when I was, my first international economics course was with Giorgio Basevi, who's Professor Giorgio Basevi, who's here, and to sort of kind of make sense of what's going on is very difficult to do. The, you know, the U.S., really, the global international order was crafted by the U.S., really with U.S. interests in mind, economic and strategic. And it thrived, arguably, until the end of the 1990s. And that happened with and, you know, kind of ended with a lot of people would put the, you know, crises in 2001, but really it was the anti-global movement that sort of started to really, you know, trade was always a politically sensitive thing in the United States, but then it became really politically sensitive. Not because the U.S. was being ripped off, but rather because, you know, the no globals thought that the U.S. and other OECD countries were ripping off the developing world. So it, you know, and so after that, there really hasn't been much progress that's been done at the global level, except in terms of the kind of similar-minded coalitions of the willing, if you will, in terms of trade agreements and these sorts of things that are all folded into WTO law. And so it became very difficult to move forward with the 166 members of the WTO right now. It did proceed, and a lot of agreements were struck, not just by between developed countries, but also between developed and developing countries and developing countries among themselves. And so this created, if you will, for a long time, an environment in which, you know, development could thrive. You know, Italy got richer, Europe got richer, the US got richer, and importantly, developing countries got richer. I mean, you could, at least in Asia, about 1.5 billion people have risen out of poverty due to economic reforms that took place, and trade was always an important part of that. So that's really important for the global economy. You know, nevertheless, the U.S. has really never been a free trade economy. It drives me nuts when you hear this. We don't want free trade anymore. It was never a free trade economy. It's always had its barriers to trade. And it's pretty much on par. It's been on par with its OECD neighbors. Some of them are higher. You know, Europe is slightly higher on average than the U.S. Australia is slightly lower. New Zealand quite a bit lower. Singapore doesn't even, it's not part of the OECD, but doesn't even have tariffs. But it isn't as though the U.S. is this free trade economy in the midst of a bunch of protectionists. It's just, that's never been the case. And yet, in the U.S., trade has been, you know, it has a very bad connotation, and this is bipartisan. right? Biden pretty much carried forward what Trump did during his first administration and added a few of his own things. Earlier it was hard to distinguish the difference between the trade policies of Bernie Sanders and of Donald Trump, except in terms of rhetoric. The USTR under Biden, Catherine Tai, always spoke of labor-focused trade policy for a labor-focused economy, for a labor-focused country, always focusing on that, and delivering very little, if anything, for labor, and certainly not for foreign labor, right? So this has been pretty stagnant in the US for a while. But Liberation Day is different. It violates trade agreements, it violates WTO rules, it punishes friends as well as adversaries, and violates any logical understanding of what gains from trade or what even a reciprocal tariff would look like. That Congress, which has the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations, has had no say in the US's exiting a global system it has thrived under for decades, it's actually quite shocking. It's difficult to get a free trade area through Congress, like in Europe, as was clear from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was signed in 2016. But it seems it's really easy for a president to abrogate any free trade area or areas, as it's doing right now with the USMCA, the US-Korea free trade area, the US-Singapore free trade area, US-Australia, and 15 other free trade areas. Okay, these all have 100% liberal tariffs, 98 to 100% liberal tariffs, right? So you do have free trade. And so how do you put a reciprocal tariff? I mean, you hear sometimes the administration saying we're doing this to bring down tariffs. Well, there's a way to do that. And the US has done that very frequently. So it's very puzzling. And I'd be happy to talk about how bonkers this all is during the talk, but and how it relates to Transatlantic Partnership. But I just want to make 3 points more focusing on US-Europe in kind of a broad context for going forward. First, Liberation Day is bad for the partnership. Good thing everybody is sitting down. The EU is being slammed even by the spurious economic logic by Trump because of its trade surplus. But, the US runs a big trade services surplus with Europe. And so if you include services, which the US has a comparative advantage in, essentially that trade surplus comes out to about, I looked it up, about 48 billion euros. So about 3% of total trade, 3%. Very, very small. And it's really not clear if President Trump has ever understood that the US is really a services economy and has a strong comparative advantage in services. And services isn't just hamburger flipping. It's high-end services, right? So over 70% of the US economy is there. It has a big comparative advantage in services. And to leave out any calculations of services when you're considering trade policy, it's really very puzzling. As Rector Dehousse mentioned, when you put on these retaliatory barriers, it hurts the country applying them, but it's also going to hurt the US. And it's not just with tariffs. I think you're going to see a lot more boycotts coming forward. Already in Canada, there's a lot of US boycotts. Tesla is taking it on the nose in Germany and elsewhere. And so there could be a lot more of that. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the US has $4 trillion in foreign direct investment in the US, in the EU, as of 2023. Or 60% of its total abroad. And Europe accounts for 65% of the total inflow of stock of foreign direct investment in the US. So you have this huge part, and by the way, there's 8 million people who work for EU multinationals in the US. So this is a huge partnership and very important for both and not to be taken for granted. And one becomes very nervous, not just for trade flows, but this foreign direct investment that has built up so much over the years and have been so dominant in the partnership. I think just to throw in one thing, I also am concerned about climate leadership because climate change has become such a very important policy priority for both the EU and what used to be the US, because it's a priority for the world, Donald Trump has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And that, of course, is it's a big issue. How much that makes a difference compared to what policies are at the state and local level is unclear. But what is clear is that the EU has played a very big leadership role in climate, in trying to address climate change. And can the EU go alone on this? And some work that I've done with my co-authors estimating what the effects of a closer cooperation, in other words, liberalizing, having free trade in environmental goods and services, does have a palpable effect on addressing climate change. And so one thinks if you're liberalizing it is positive, you can imagine what happens when you go in the opposite direction. It's going to be a challenge, also hurting the political support for green innovation, green trade, and these things in Europe. If you've got the second biggest polluter in the world that is decided doesn't care about this stuff anymore. Okay. Secondly, what to do about all this, and again, getting specifically to EU retaliation. It's the person who's applying the tariff. The countries that apply the tariff tend to be the ones that are hurt the worst. But it is simply a political reality, even a political necessity, that you're going to have some sort of response. And who knows? It might be possibly used as an instrument to unliberate the U.S. from its own destructive tariffs. And the EU seems to be ready to put on the correct tariffs. It knows how to do this. But I think what's really important for the EU to do is to go through legal channels in doing this. When it's been facing China, it's been going through the WTO. It puts on its tariffs, but it did it under looking at WTO rules, and China is facing it there. So kind of trying to continue this global system we've had is important, rather than doing what Trump 1, Biden, and Trump 2 is now doing, and completely trying to do something outside is a problem. The EU can continue to go forward with FTAs. It's currently ratifying agreements with Mercosur, Chile, Kenya, and Mexico. It's negotiating agreements with India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And in the past, these have been very difficult to ratify, as everyone in this room probably knows. Maybe Liberation Day makes these things easier to do. It might also make it easier to sort of forge a productive relationship with China. I also would suggest that the EU should join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership that the UK just joined. There's more talk about it. I see The Economist is interested in as well. I saw in a recent edition. I mentioned this at a EU-Australia conference in November, and the EU Commission representatives was, shall we say, not keen on the idea, but I think things change. And it wouldn't be something that would take that long to deal with, because the CPTPP already knows what the EU commercial policy looks like, because it just went through at the UK, and the UK has a lot of similarities. So that could be it, and we've done some estimate of this as well, so you could get actually some very big economic gains from that sort of approach. It would anchor the EU more in the Asia Pacific, which, as you said, the countries I rattled off shows that the EU wants to do this, and could actually also play a leadership role in doing this. This, of course, brings us back to the idea of a US-EU FTA. Most people in this room will remember TTIP, that the Obama administration tried to put forward, and it really failed on Obama, mostly due to the Democrats. But interestingly, Elon Musk this weekend, meeting with Prime Minister Meloni, talked about saying, hey, I really don't like tariffs. Free trade between Europe and the US is really what we'd like. I don't think that is likely in the mind of the current president, since he seems to think that the EU is created as a means to screw the US, and other parts of the administration calling the EU hapless, and the explosion of hurtful criticism from Europe in the ears of a, shall we say, sensitive president may not ring so well. But who knows what can happen in times of necessity. Trump is using pretty arbitrary tariffs based on what's called the International Emergencies Powers Act, International Economic Emergency Power Act, at a time when the US has got full employment. Seems a bit rich. The world economy seems to be taking a turn for the worse right now. Certainly the stock markets are. People are predicting now a greater chance of recession. You know, what happens when there really is an emergency? Maybe things take a different course. So that might be important. And finally, just the last point is on partnerships and development. I mentioned that the reduction in poverty by 1.5 billion. I think that this is really a shame that the U.S. is no longer, it seems, at least in the medium term, going to be a partner with the EU in sort of helping the global South as it develops. Okay, we've got the USAID that's is being significantly reduced, if not completely destroyed. That's a problem. The U.S. has always been one of the most the most generous donor of development assistance in absolute numbers, but relative to GDP, it's one of the least generous in the OECD. It's like 1/4% of GDP. That still comes out to $66 billion, so that can make an effect on Africa, but it was never really that important part of it. If you look at some of the media on this, it seems like it's huge. It hasn't been huge, but now it's going to be gone, and that's a problem. And I don't know that much about grand strategy, but in a country where there is bipartisan consensus on the need to compete with China and build coalitions, it seems like a strange approach to hit regional allies with nasty tariffs. Tariffs of almost 50% are being hit on Laos, PDR, and Cambodia, right, who's, you know, just recently moved up to lower middle income countries from being low income economies. And, you know, they're bordering with China, right? Cambodia particularly is in China's camp. If you want to make friends, that's a weird way to do it. The same with Vietnam, who is a natural ally to the United States and is a natural adversary of China in many ways, and now it's being hit with a 46% tariff. You know, it's already talking about negotiations. Vietnam, I read this morning, was thinking of dropping its tariffs to 5%, so it's doing something of that, but it's doing it without sort of reducing the 46% yet. So we don't know next what happens, I guess. And I personally don't know if this is being used as a negotiating tool, but it doesn't. The president's never said he was going to be using these negotiating tools, even though people around him have said it. So, you know, I'm quite nervous that this stays, unfortunately. Sorry to depress you.
Well, I didn't have much to be cheerful of. That's true, but we had to look at the world as it is first, and hopefully also at the way it ought to be, but this will come later. Nathalie, over to you.
I'm actually going to be optimistic.
Great, great, that's a lot.
I'm going to really surprise you, because so far actually in this series I've been really dark, but I'm obviously not going to be optimistic economically speaking, but politically speaking, but I'll get to this at the end. I mean, I wanted to start off actually with a point that Mike was emphasizing, which is, you know, the fact that the United States that has now moved from an average 3.7% tariff to, you know, over 20% tariff, really speaks of the destruction of a system built, you know, led, and in the interest of the United States itself. So, I mean, I'm totally with Mike in really highlighting simply how cataclysmic basically this is. And I think it's cataclysmic to the extent to which that system that we're talking about goes beyond free trade, which, as you say, the US was kind of, yeah, but never really fully in. But what is being destroyed is what is commonly known as the international liberal order, multilateralism, and free trade as a component of something bigger, which is being destroyed. You know, if this tariff story was happening in and of itself, it would be bad enough. But it's happening alongside a systematic destruction of an order built and led by the United States over the last 80 years. I think it's also worth highlighting a point that you were mentioning, i.e. the fact that there is nothing reciprocal about this. I mean, in fact, in the weird formula that was used to impose tariffs, reciprocity was not part of the formula, right? I mean, it was this kind of weird thing of you kind of, divide, deficit divided by total imports, and that's your tariff rate, divide that by 2, and that's, that's your result. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I'm not sure there are that many economics papers, in peer-reviewed journals sustaining, the sort of goodness of this approach. And I think this kind of brings me to this question of the rationale and what is the rationale behind it. And, on the one hand, I think, and this is really non-economist me talking, but I've heard 3 broad sort of sets of arguments. One, and I agree with Mike, one that you often hear is, well, this is a negotiating tool. Which could be about negotiating a deal on tariffs, but it could be about negotiating a deal on buying Greenland, or it could be about negotiating all sorts of things. But let's say tariffs as a negotiating tool. Now, presumably, tariffs as a negotiating tool, if they are effective, would mean that once the deal is reached on whatever it is, the tariffs would presumably go, right? So that's, in a sense, option 1. Option 2 that you hear is, no, this is about tariffs as a means of bringing back manufacturing jobs to America. So this is about the reindustrialization of the United States. Now that is going to work, presumably, only if, not on the one hand, you impose tariffs and no one imposes tariffs on you. And so whatever, you're a European company and you can no longer export to the United States. And so you move your business to the United States. So that only works if actually there isn't reciprocity, right? And there's only a sort of one-directional tariffs coming from the United States. Now that second explanation is in contradiction with the first, because that explanation presumably says that tariffs have to be imposed and they have to stay. Because of course, if they go as part of that negotiation, then the trick doesn't work anymore. And then you have a sort of third explanation, which I guess is closer to the second, but it's actually getting at something different, which is tariffs are imposed in order to raise revenue. And you want to raise revenue because you then want to do other things like, lower your debt. You need to raise quite a lot of tariffs to do that. Anyway, as opposed to whatever, maybe reduce taxes, right? So you kind of, but again, if you go for that third sort of, explanation, then you can't go for the first. So there's a real contradiction between these sort of rationalizations, and to an extent, I think that these are rationalizations, they're kind of ex post rationalizations for something that probably is actually much simpler, i.e. tariff is the most beautiful word in the vocabulary. Right. So, in a sense, it seems that they are ex post rationalizations for those that are around, close, in love, whatever, with Trump, who try and provide some sort of rational explanation for something that probably isn't rational at all. And that given that what really characterizes this administration is loyalty, and almost, sort of erecting, the president almost as close to the divine, and therefore no one wanting to tell the emperor that he's got no clothes, right? And so you find all sorts of reasons to basically, sort of explain why tariffs may be a good idea, but actually it may simply not be the way in which the president himself thinks. Anyway, moving on to what the effects of all of this might be, and then of course I'll move on to Europe. I mean, okay, the first effect we've been kind of talking about. I'm not going to say much about it because I'm not an economist. I mean, it seems that we're headed into a recession. Okay, and the recession also being, I think, intrinsic, the recession being, I think, strictly connected to the unpredictability, and the unpredictability, as far as this tariff story is concerned, actually being intrinsically connected to this weird formula that is being used. Because the weird formula suggests that the tariff rate would constantly change, yeah, because the deficit, the trade deficit would constantly change, and the level of imports would constantly change, and so the magic tariff number would also constantly change, adding unpredictability to unpredictability. So I think there's a story there that has to do with recession and the nexus with unpredictability. There's the point that, Mike, you were mentioning. I mean, the fact that this disproportionately hits basically poor countries. Right? And so this really fits into this broader plot of getting rid of USAID. I think it's part of this broader story of, in a sense, the kind of cruelty of it, right? Which I think connects to this sort of weird result in which actually the real baddies are not hit, right? I mean, Russia, North Korea, are completely unaffected. Now, you may say, well, that's because they've got sanctions. And yet the fact that Lesotho is going to pay a higher price than Russia, despite sanctions, really strikes as being cruel. I don't know how else to put it. And then, of course, and you were mentioning it, the fact that this really hits allies. And here is where we get to Europe. And how Europe should respond. And it seems to me that, often there is this, especially in the sort of public debate, positioning negotiations and retaliation as if these were different things. Now, it's clear that the inclination, the objective of the European Union will always be that of finding some sort of agreement, right? I mean, we're not totally suicidal. And yet underpinning that negotiation is the retaliation. I mean, the point is that you present yourself to a negotiation, with some carrots, but presumably if those don't work, you also need to have some sticks in your pocket, and that's where the retaliation fits in. I'll come back to retaliation, but I think the other point that, Mike, you were mentioning, which I think is incredibly important, is the story of diversification. And I think it's incredibly important, and you were sort of mentioning the way in which, maybe this is actually going to give a new impulse to EU trade policy. Be it in the implementation of the agreement with Mercosur and Mexico, in indeed forging new agreements with India and Indonesia. I mean, you went through the list. I think it was significant, the fact that, sort of the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council responded on Liberation Day from Samarkand in Central Asia, right? In the first sort of ever EU Central Asia summit. So I think this kind of speaks to, again, much like I was making a similar point that I was to what I was making earlier, I think this is significant because it fits into this broader story, which is not just economic, but it's also political, that perhaps in shorthand we could kind of put and sort of capture in terms of, the rest of the West with the rest, right? So in a sense, the rest of the West without the United States, how is it that they're now re-engaging with the once upon a time rest, right? With, the so-called global South. And I think, the fact that there may be, as part of this trade story, diversification that speaks, I think, to this narrative, which is not just narrative, but policy, which is not just economic, but it's also political in nature. I say it's not just economic because, again, this is something that also predates Liberation Day. I mean, back in February, the entire College of Commissioners travels to Delhi to explore how to deepen the relationship with India. A few weeks before that, on the occasion of the G20 in South Africa, the Commission unveils this new plan, this new partnership with South Africa. So I think there is this real sense of, again, in this situation, how is it that we diversify our relations? But then, of course, there is the retaliation aspect to it. And one can imagine that, as always, it's going to be a kind of negotiated thing. And indeed, there are going to be some countries that are going to press for a harder line, and countries like Italy or like France that are going to, or like Ireland, that are going to press for a softer line. But I think that whereas perhaps if one looked at it from a purely economic sort of standpoint, one could say, well, retaliation hurts you economically. But given that this is not just an economic story and it's a political story. And given that perhaps even more than a political story, it's a psychological story. I mean, this is a bully, right? I mean, when you're faced with a bully in a playground, you don't just yeah, exactly. Just say, give me more, and show the other cheek, right? I mean, you've got to respond. And I think it's kind of clear to everyone that, again, if you are to actually obtain something in a negotiation with a bully, you want to make sure that actually there are some sticks in your pocket. Now, I wanted to end on that on a positive note, which is nothing to do with economics, but actually has to do with politics, because making a positive case of economics now would be a hard sell. But I want to say this because, if I think back in our, sort of seminars back in the fall and in January, and I was really in a dark mood. Yeah. I mean, I was really in this mood of, we're in this kind of inexorable second wave of nationalist populism. And now Trump got elected in the United States, and this is actually going to galvanize our European populists even further. And I've actually changed my mind. I mean, I actually think that because what is happening in the United States is just so over the top, right? It's actually maybe I'm being too optimistic, but it may be having the opposite effect on Europe. Let's call it the Canadian effect on Europe, right? And I think we're beginning to see some signals of this. I mean, broadly speaking, I think it's significant that if you look at the latest Eurobarometer, support for the European Union is at 74%, highest number for the last 42 years, right? And I think there is this sense of, oh shit, I mean, in times like this, we kind of need to stick together. And this is, of course, not the kind of message that nationalist populist forces give. I think the fact that especially those nationalists that have been very openly supportive of Trump are today in a very uncomfortable position, right? I mean, they may be, let's say, not particularly intelligent. Like, for instance, there's a leader of the opposition, one of the leaders of the governing coalition in this country that I wouldn't kind of put up there in terms of IQ, that says that tariffs are an opportunity, right? Okay, so there are some that sort of inflict self-harm in that very sort of open, explicit way. But the ones that are a little bit more intelligent are visibly uncomfortable. Because it's very difficult to support Trump while Trump is harming you, right? Or at least, one thing is to support Trump, ideologically, right? One thing is to support Trump as he lashes out on countries that you don't really care about. Ukraine, the Palestinians, the Yemenis, I mean, whoever, yeah? One thing is to support Trump when he's lashing out against you, right? And that just becomes a very difficult case to sustain. And so you tend to not really speak out much, you're kind of uncomfortable. And so I think, this is as far as the support for nationalists. You have, on the flip side of that, as I said, support for the EU, which is rising really rather significantly. And the fact that it is those political leaders who have actually, by now, a track record of standing up to Trump in different ways, right? I mean, you can do it a la Zelensky in the Oval Office. You can do it a la Macron, also in the Oval Office. Remember, sort of Macron putting his hand on Trump's knee, basically telling him, you're wrong there, So you can do it in more polite ways, maybe like Keir Starmer. So you can do it in different shapes and forms, but it's those leaders that are seen as standing up, or like Trudeau, now Carney. Those leaders are actually up in the polls. And so, as I said, I think that there is a potential to use the fact that what is happening in the US being so, as I said, over the top, to actually enable Europe to, sort of go past that curve, I mean, go past, the tip of that curve of nationalist populism, that second wave, if you like, is not to be taken for granted. I think it's an opportunity, and I think it remains to be seen whether that opportunity is seized. But I'm somewhat more optimistic, politically speaking, about Europe than I was just only a few months ago.
Well, how nice to be reminded that there is always a silver lining, because I must say it was a bit difficult to see at first sight. No. But otherwise, of course, as you will have noticed, there is a fair degree of convergence in the two analyses that we've heard, even though our two speakers were speaking from a, let's say, different standpoint, but great similarity in the analysis of why we are where we are and how rational is all this. A fair degree of similarity too in the remark that somehow independently of what, let's say, economic theory would suggest, it will be politically difficult for the EU to simply sit idle and do nothing and wait for the Americans to reconsider the decision that was just taken. That said, there are many more issues that we can discuss, and we have for that a very good 40 minutes, which is good. So I would invite those who want to intervene, ask questions, or give their own views on the topic to raise their hand as you did. And I think you were first. Yes.
Thank you both for that very excellent overview of the very interesting and honestly crazy things going back home. Two questions I have. First one, going off at the point how you, Professor Plummer, said that like this whole trading order was built by the United States. Have we ever seen in history another superpower basically saying, yeah, this whole building I constructed, I'm just going to light it on fire for spite? I don't know, to own the libs? Like, I'm genuinely serious. Like, it seems so shocking that any superpower would basically destroy the very foundations of its own power. And second, I'm curious as to like what your thoughts about where Liberation Day puts China and its role in the world economy, because from what I've read up until now, it seemed like China was a stunted power. You know, it had kind of hit its max in terms of economic growth and political influence. But now with the U.S. basically like declaring a trade war against everyone, maybe China looks like the more responsible partner. I could just be, that's just my speculation, but I'm just wondering what you guys have to say about that.
I think so.
I can't think of another example of this sort of a thing happening. I don't think we should exaggerate this because it's not war, you know. At least it's not people shooting each other and starting out a conflagration of sorts. So, you know, there are examples of much worse things happening. You know, in 1948 with the Havana Charter, the U.S. walked away from that as well. You know, it's true that had been, you know, that idea was developed at Bretton Woods in 44 and was taken forward, and the U.S. pulled out of it. That was a bit shocking. But I can't think of in like modern times anything like that has happened in international organizations. It seems very strange to me. On the idea of China, I think that the Chinese government is probably pretty pleased with what's going on. This is a bad time for it to take a shot economically with these tariffs up to almost 70% on China. China's been anticipating this. It has a major problem with aggregate demand. The real estate crisis is not over, even though things seem to have settled down. And it has, you know, other issues, overcapacity, these sort of things. But if you think of it from a strategic point of view, and obviously that's very big in China, China must be delighted because it has, for a long time tried to separate the U.S. from its European allies and try to have a China policy, even with the Belt and Road Initiative and these things. Now the U.S. goes and does it by itself. The same is true, particularly in its backyard in Southeast Asia, where it has, South China Sea, those kind of conflicts, as you know very well, has had problems. Now all of a sudden, it seems like it's portraying itself as the responsible protector, if you will, of a global order. And you even see a bit more cooperation in Northeast Asia. Some of it is just for show, but it is for show. I mean, would that have happened 10 years ago? So I think China is pretty happy with itself. And then you got to ask yourself, from the U.S. point of view, doesn't this also look like an own goal, right? I mean, you were mentioning about the economics of politics. Anything about economics has politics in it. Certainly trade policy is all about politics and things. So that is a very, very important dimension of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to this that, I mean, I think you're right. We haven't seen anything like this before. I guess that what we have seen before and what this would fit into is the fact that if you consider this, so the United States was never obviously an empire, right? But if we understand the order that the US built as a kind of empire of sorts, right? I mean, not with the coercive element of it, but of an empire of sorts, then you can look at and you can make the parallel that one would draw is generally empires don't end because they are beaten by someone else, but normally, or often at least, empires have ended through implosion. And so, in a sense, you can look at this as an act of implosion, especially if it's then followed through. On China, what I would say is I think it largely depends on how China itself will play at this. I think it indeed presents an opportunity. And I was struck, actually. I mean, the moment in which I realized that this is where things might be headed was actually before Liberation Day. It was at the Munich Security Conference. When at the Munich Security Conference, you probably all heard about J.D. Vance's speech. Now, the speech after J.D. Vance's speech was by Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister. And it was incredible the way in which he played this, because he didn't say anything extraordinary. I mean, the Chinese line is kind of always the same, to be honest, yeah? But he really emphasized the fact that here we are for you traumatized Europeans, we're the predictable ones. And you could really sense that, if they play their cards well, they could really capitalize on it. But it's not to be taken for granted that they will play their cards well, because coming to the trade bit of it, if their reaction to the US tariffs, which of course, as we have seen, is, a sort of response, retaliation vis-a-vis the United States, but if what they will end up doing is the even greater overcapacity that they will generate, dumping it on Europe, then there's going to be a European reaction to that. So I think it will largely depend on how China itself plays its cards. If it plays its cards smartly, it will basically see, in Europe, a player that at this point in time will probably feel, well, we can't really afford to have kind of, trade wars left, right, and center with everyone. So I think there's going to be an appetite in Europe for at least a timeout with China. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say a kind of rapprochement, but certainly a timeout. But if it overplays its hand, it could actually go in the opposite direction.
Interesting. Yes, you were next.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your insights. And I would like to ask two questions, one for Professor Plummer and another for Professor Tocci. When it comes to the EU's growing FTA talks with Southeast Asian countries and India, as they become more rigorous and more active, how do you see the possibility of EU joining in RCEP or CPTPP? And what might be the potential gains they can get from diversification into Asia-Pacific region? And when it comes to, for you, Professor Tocci, you stood out the United States becoming a bully. And what might this Liberation Day, will this grant a new space for the BRICS to raise more voices or becoming more powerful in global world order? And will China and Russia be able to rally around with low and middle income nations and gain more voices in international dialogue? Thank you very much.
Okay, first the question on joining RCEP for the EU. It's definitely making these initiatives. This isn't the first time the EU sort of tried to set up, for example, a free trade area with ASEAN and realized that the kind of agreement that the EU would need was just not possible with such diverse Southeast Asian countries. It just didn't work. And so they sort of began to emulate what the US was doing, the Bush administration did, and was called the Enterprise for ASEAN Initiative, where the EU, the Americans said, okay, we want to have this as an umbrella agreement based on the US-Singapore agreement, and then we'll try bilaterally to talk things through. And one of them had gone through, almost went through all the way, was the US-Thai agreement, and Bush and Thaksin at the time agreed to do it, and 2 weeks later he was overthrown with a military coup, and that agreement all of a sudden is no longer going to be possible because it's thought of as being a Thaksin agreement. His daughter, by the way, is prime minister right now. And then also with Malaysia, which didn't go through. So the US didn't do much with it, but Europeans could have learned that it would have been more productive if it had gone individually. And I think this is what you're seeing that's happening. I mean, the EU could have a free trade with ASEAN, but what it's going to need for its own approval processes that's probably out of the question. So it's better to do these individually. I don't think that it could, I mean, it won't join RCEP because RCEP is really a Asian organization, and I'd have to go back and look at the charter, but I don't, there certainly is no country that is outside of South or Southeast or Northeast Asia that's thinking about joining RCEP. But the CPTPP, I think it's actually a pretty good chance of it for a number of reasons. I think it would be great for the European presence in the region. It's a very high quality agreement based on the TPP that the Americans had developed. And so it's a very modern agreement and would satisfy a lot of the demands of of what the Europeans would have, having a very high level advanced agreement. I think that would be possible. I think that in the current context of things, I think Nathalie's right, this would actually politically make it easier both in Southeast Asia and in Europe to go forward. The question is what to do in terms of how to do that from a practical point of view. There's 7 countries have applied. The next one in line was supposed to be China, which is formally applied, and then it would come Taiwan. But instead, what they've done is they've convened just in February. It's the first post-UK accession enlargement consideration, which was Costa Rica, which is much smaller. It's going to be more difficult, pretty easy to go through. I think if the EU really seriously did want to apply, it could go very quickly. Now, whether or not politically it's possible, I don't know. It's very complicated in Europe, but it seems to me that times have changed, and this idea that the Americans might be bringing a new perspective from Europe might make that happen. Certainly is giving a bigger perspective from Asia. I just saw this morning the real eye-opening speech by the Prime Minister of Singapore about saying, this is, being very blunt about everything. We're only hit by 10% tariffs, but problem is it's really threatening the global order, and this is going to be a problem further on down the line. and it's sort of the US isn't reliable anymore. And so looking for other partners is natural.
On the BRICS, I mean, does all this make the BRICS more powerful? I don't think so. I mean, I think that the whole story of the transformation or unraveling, if you like, of multilateralism kind of went through different phases. So you have phase one, which I would put round about, the global financial crisis. This is the time in which, first debates about multipolarity emerged. And there was a sense that, power was shifting in the international system and you needed to reform multilateralism to make it more reflective of, sort of power shifts. So that was in a sense Mark one. Of course that didn't, and that's when, as you will recall, debates about, reforming the IMF and reforming the World Bank and etc. Didn't quite happen. Then you have sort of Mark two, in which, given that didn't happen, and there was this kind of growing alienation, the beginning of the polarization within the international system, that there was this sense of, well, maybe what we could do is kind of have a sort of, let's call it concentric circles multilateralism, in which you have a kind of close-knit hub, let's say the G7, that's where thicker rules apply. Then you have kind of slightly wider rules, you export them to the G20, then you go even wider. And if you go back to the years 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, including during COVID, I think that was the sense there, yeah? I mean, think about, when was it? When there was the Glasgow COP and Italy had the G20 presidency, and there were, agreements on methane reduction. And there was a sense of, okay, first you agree within the G7. Then once you've agreed, you export that agreement to the G20. Then you export it to COP. So sort of concentric circles multilateralism. Then that didn't kind of work out because there was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So then you go through this polarization phase. I mean, I long-winded answer to come to your BRICS question. That to me was the phase, this kind of polarization phase, in which the BRICS had political wind in its sails. Because that was the time in which there was the G7, we, the West, and then there was the BRICS really led by China. So it was kind of, West, Rest, Global East, Global West kind of story. Yeah? And that's where it became also increasingly clear that the BRICS was really being, as I said, led by China. And in which the Russia-China dimension of the BRICS really became a kind of thing, right? In a sense now, I mean, Trump has really upended all of this, because Trump's world is a world of empire, not the real empire that was, I mean, the order that is being destroyed, but the illusion of empire, as in the illusion of real empire. And so in a sense there is, I'm not sure whether it's empire or when maybe there's actually, I was on the train coming here, there's a really good piece in the FT by Gideon Rachman that is actually talking about it in terms of mafia families. It's just come out a few hours ago. And so it's basically kind of, mafia families, there are different families, and at some point there are wars between these mafia families. And so perhaps you get to a point when these empires actually clash, whether it's, the US with Russia and China, these are the three empires. But broadly speaking, I mean, the work happens within the family, where you can be magnanimous at times, but if you don't behave well, if the colony doesn't behave well, then there's a big stick to be waged. And so in a sense, you see the way in which Trump seems to certainly get on with Russia. And there's a sort of, yes, indeed, there's this tariff story, but there's a sort of seems to be a kind of understanding with China as well in a kind of weird way. I mean, certainly in strategic terms, yeah? I mean, when in his address to Congress, there was not so much in the speech, but in one of the answers, in Trump's address to Congress, when was it, about a month ago, that he was in referring, at some point there was a question about what you would, what would you do, if there were a war in Taiwan. And his response to that was, well, now that TSMC has announced 100 billion investment in the US, of course it would be terrible, but we would be fine. So there's this sense, so in a sense, if there is this understanding between wannabe empires, then this kind of leaves the BRICS in a stranger place compared to phase 3 that we were in before.
I think, yes, you were next.
Thank you guys a lot. This is really fascinating to me. I'm curious, Nathalie, especially, you said that we're just assuming there's going to be a recession at this point. Can you guys elaborate a little bit more on why we should assume that so soon? If maybe this is unlikely, but if Trump walks back on tariffs over the course of the next month, could we then avoid a recession, or is the damage already done? That's the first question. And actually, I'll just stay with that one. Yeah, thank you guys very much.
Well, I'll leave the economists to say the serious thing. All I will say, and then I don't really have an answer to the question, all I will say is that, the markets, oil prices. I mean, oil Brent is at what, $62? So these are all indications of an anticipation of a recession. And I think the reason why that anticipation is there is because there is the beginning of the realization that maybe it's not a negotiating tool. Maybe he actually thinks tariffs are great. But I think what's implicit in your question is, I assume, but I don't know. I mean, I leave this to Mike. I assume that if actually now markets and, whatever are being too pessimistic in assuming that this will actually play out and magically tariffs go tomorrow morning, maybe a recession can be averted. I don't know. But the indications are that this is here to stay for a while.
Yeah, I think that, well before Liberation Day, the Atlanta Fed was predicting recession. And a fairly significant one. In a way, it's been, a long time into the cycle. There are macroeconomists here that know these better. It's been, a long time into the cycle. We've had fairly stubborn inflation with interest rates that have been kept up. Last empirical work I looked at would suggest it takes 6 to 18 months really for these changes in monetary policy to really bite on the economy. And it could simply have been the time that it was going to happen, even independent of these tariffs. But I think in part, definitely some of these estimates, people that were predicting a recession, and everybody's predicting a slowdown, but those predicting a recession has to do with the great uncertainty. I think Nathalie was mentioning this earlier, the great uncertainty about what's being done in a way, in a perverse way, that knowing exactly what these tariffs are looking like, that to a private sector decision maker, that's better than these on and off 25%, 50%, 250% tariffs, whatever was coming out of Trump's social thing was very upsetting about where that was going to go. And I think that uncertainty is very bad for investment. I think ultimately it's going to be bad for investment going forward, but I think that the numbers right now are really have to do with momentum that was prior to Liberation Day. I mean, going forward, who knows what happens, but.
Well, that seems like a good transition to keep on.
Okay, just really following up on what Michael said, because on my view, what is really the biggest change is really this huge amount of global uncertainty, and this is what curbs investment. This is what I think is the reason of the reaction of the stock market. So my point is a little bit, I'm not talking about the current macroeconomic condition, but mainly go in the most general sense of where we are heading to on a geopolitical context. So 1 year ago, we are talking about decoupling from China. Now we are talking about decoupling from the US. So at this point, My question is that should we really look as European or Asian to new alliances, or we should just accept that we are in a tripartite bloc with the US, the America goes from Panama maybe to Canada and Groenland, and we have Europe that deals with Russia, China may annex Taiwan and does whatever it wants in Asia, and maybe we all compete for some relation with Africa and some of the global south. But given this uncertainty, even if you do any kind of trade agreement, nobody is going to invest or change the global value chain that since tomorrow can go through Mexico instead of through Vietnam. So the question is that what are the pros and the cons of looking for new trade alliances in this global uncertainty rather than to the sort of more autarkic approach within each bloc?
Wow, good question. I mean, I think I'm not sure whether you're going to see a more autarkic approach within each bloc, but I do think that the, let's say, the kind of global de-risking strategy, right? I mean, perhaps not a global decoupling strategy, but at least a kind of US-China de-risking strategy has as its two components, on the one hand, what we were discussing earlier, i.e. you diversify your relations with others. And I mean, there are good big players out there, right? I mean, India's a big player. So it's not as if, the world begins and ends with the US and China. And in any case, you're not talking about closing yourself off to US and China. You're talking about diversifying. But then I do think that there is a component which is not autarkic, but it's definitely about deepening the EU itself, yeah? I mean, the question is, does this generate new momentum for the Savings and Investment Union, for example, right? Does it generate, even beyond, the EU, does it generate new momentum for enlargement? Yeah, I mean, you can even look at that as part of a kind of global de-risking strategy. How does it change? So I think there's this kind of internal element and an external element, but I think what ties these two things together is what we were talking earlier. I mean, I think the political question is really key here, because if you continue to have a more nationalistic EU, well, a more nationalistic EU certainly is not going to deepen the European Union, and a more nationalistic EU is protectionist. So it's not going to diversify with the kind of things that we've been talking about. If this is going to generate this political effect that I was optimistically talking about earlier, then there's more of a case for these things actually happening. But I think the jury's out at this point.
That's a great question, because, a year ago, 2 years ago, we were looking at the effects of nearshoring, friendshoring, and reshoring. Right? I remember my co-author and I did some estimates of these effects, and they're all very negative, however you do it. And so it's not, we're all pretending as though, everything was open before. You really had these active considerations about how are you going to organize your production. And I think that right now, of course, I'm looking from the US point of view. Unfortunately, this idea of reshoring seems to be on everyone's mind. I mean, the US will never bring manufacturing back. 9% of employment right now. And if you look at the numbers, I was looking at this weekend, they're dropping in all, OECD countries. I mean, it's just not. It's just not going to happen. And by the way, why do you need it to happen? Right? You've got full employment. You're doing more services than manufacturing, and it doesn't. But this speaks to a political message that is, I think, important. And if I could make one thing you'd mentioned earlier about this. About the why of these tariffs for revenue, right? We know the revenue can't be very big, but it tells a story just like Reaganomics told the story. I can cut your taxes and balance the budget. You can have your cake and eat it too, because efficiency will go. And that, of course, didn't work. And it was supposed to work with the 2017 tax cuts. The same thing came up. But it's so politically attractive, right? To say that you can raise revenue and make foreigners pay for it and cut taxes on Americans plays to a certain group in the United States that wants to hear that. So I really do think that plays it. That's a little tangential to your question, but it's interesting to see how this is kind of reforming itself, that question.
It's politics stupid. Thank you. We are getting close to the end of our time, so I would propose to collect a number of questions, starting with Guido, who's next to the mic.
Thank you. Very interesting presentations. I have like two short questions. I don't know how long the answers. The first one, Mike, you were making the point of like that the responses should be playing with the existing rules. And I was watching today the speech by Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, a few days ago, saying we are in a new world, the pre-existing world order is not there anymore, it's over. So I wanted to have a little bit your opinion on, if he is right, how is the world trade system going to work without the WTO and the existing institutions we know about? And Nathalie, for you, you mentioned your optimism, and I was wondering whether you were concerned about what you describe as optimism is just maybe rallying around the flag when you have an external threat that tends to be short-lived and it might not last for long.
Thank you. There were, yes, questions in the back.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's been interesting to listen to, especially as a full disclosure, not economist at all. So my question is really brief. Does this mean that the WTO is essentially dead or zombified?
That's simple and dramatic. Yes, just next to the previous speaker.
Hi, thank you again. My question is about the role of the US dollar. And if, in short, maybe it's too soon to really make any conclusions, but assuming that the tariff system and this sort of adversarial approach to the world is maintained in economic relations, what does that mean for the role of the US dollar?
Thank you for raising this. I noticed that we had indeed not mentioned this important aspect of the question. I think this is enough on your plate to, and maybe I can, for once, ask to Nathalie to kick off.
Yeah, and I'll be very brief because I'm sure Mike has a lot more to say about this. I mean, on the question of, is this sort of rally around the European flag going to be short-lived? I think it essentially depends on whether the EU is going to deliver. I mean, I think basically it is, and this is why I was just cautiously optimistic, not optimistic. I think there is a genuine sense of it's only if we stick together that we can navigate this, whether it's economically, whether it's in security terms, etc. But if it doesn't work out, if what we end up seeing is some sort of mix of, no real retaliation, a greater hit to the EU than to other countries, I mean, not just the United States, if this is actually going to be used to, in many respects, unravel what has been built. I mean, Mike earlier was talking about climate. You have the Italian Prime Minister saying, oh, well, rather than retaliation, we should actually get rid of the ideological Green Deal, right? So if it's used in that way, then presumably that rally around the flag effect is not going to be long-lived, right? But the jury's out. So I think it's a credit that, the public is giving, and it's an open question whether it's going to be used. On WTO, I have the same, because WTO has been very, very silent. Yeah, so maybe it's already dead.
Yeah, that's a tough one, yeah. I guess putting those two questions together, the WTO has been struggling considerably since, the US failed to reappoint appeal board members under Trump, but Biden didn't do it either. And so the EU has put together the multi-party interim dispute settlement mechanism that's used as a way to sort of try to settle these disputes. But it's an interim agreement, and the US is obviously a big player in the WTO, but the Trump administration has threatened to withhold contributions to the WTO Secretariat and could very well pull out of it. My own view is I don't think the WTO is dead and things could change. In May, I have to go to a WTO conference, so I hope it doesn't die at least within the next couple of months. Just kidding. But it's it's been tough times for the organization, but I do think in the medium term, maybe not in the short term, in the medium term, it's going to be discovered that if the WTO didn't exist, you'd have to reinvent it. Maybe that's really what needs to be done.
The WTO is dead, long live the WTO.
Yeah, exactly, or something. We'll call it something else, just don't call it the Liberation Organization or something like that. But I think that could happen, and right now you've got serious issues. I mean, no one really kind of thought about this with expansion, but in the early days, liberalization was easy when it was really a very lopsided economy, and the Americans and the Europeans and the Japanese could sit down and do these deals together. Now the economy is very diverse. You've got 166 members. The reason why you're seeing, the CPTPP and the EU negotiating its own side agreements and all this stuff is because you can't do much with kind of big organization. So you need to reinvent it. And maybe that's a push. Maybe it's no longer called the World Trade Organization, or maybe you just reform. There's some big push to reform it, a constitutional amendment to it or something like that. Because I really do think that having a global agreement is important. But it is very shocking to me that people talk about these reciprocal tariffs are not reciprocal. I mean, it doesn't do it. But when we were told they were going to be reciprocal, I mean, the first thing that goes in our mind is this is absolutely antithetical for what the WTO is supposed to be about, most favored nation treatment. It is like saying, you've got the biggest, it's not as big as it used to be, but, a country that has 15% of global trade is literally going outside completely of those things. That's a problem. So I guess, I hope it doesn't die, but it will be reformed, no doubt. Now, the role of the dollar is really interesting because something else we didn't talk about here also was debt and fiscal policy, which is extremely important in all of this because without going into details, as Professor Bazevi convinced us all, that you have, the trade balances are a function of net national savings. And as long as you keep boosting that fiscal policy, that debt in the United States, you're going to have major problems. This big Doge cut, right, that's supposed to be going to do these things, he's talking about $2 trillion over several years. He's not going to do this, but even if he could, discretionary spending in the United States is estimated was $1.6 trillion a year, right? The rest of it is entitlement. So it's very hard to touch Medicare and all of these other things. 1.6 trillion, that includes defense expenditures. How much can you get out of that? It's tough. And if you're having these big tax cuts, with Trump might well get, you're going to have it boosting also this great deal of debt that needs to be financed. And by the way, that's also going to increase the trade imbalances. And if Trump is really concerned about the trade imbalances, it's going to be like a dog chasing its tail. And so the problem, and that gets to the question about what this means for the role of the dollar, is the role of the dollar. I mean, everyone has said its demise. Everyone looks at the demise of the dollar, and a lot of Americans saying no, it'll never happen. There's no one can sort of replace the dollar. There's nothing out there. Never say never with these things. A lot of things are changing, right? You've got digital currencies that are coming out, and you could see the U.S. being such bad financial shape, where it is, that tail gets chased, that the U.S. really could be in trouble. And as soon as people start turning sour on American debt, then what happens? So you got this contradiction that, as Professor Bazevi would say, if you either run these big trade imbalances and provide enough liquidity to the international market to make the dollar really a useful currency, or you want to run trade surpluses and you reduce liquidity and you've got a crisis. This was known during Bretton Woods as the Triffin dilemma, right? That anyway, we won't get in that detail, but it could be a big issue for the dollar going forward. So I don't think it's as secure as people think, and this this will be a big topic going forward.
And sorry, can I ask you something? Is this a time in which actually the EU should be focusing on the internationalization of the euro?
I think that would be a good idea, yeah, that it should focus more on the internationalization of the euro. I think that would fit in there too. I mean, you could talk about this. There are better experts than me in the room on this, but about also having, increasing European debt, Europe as a debt issuer, And doing this, that's going to have to be an important part of really making the euro more internationalized. Europe's got pretty open financial markets. I'll remind everybody in this room that SWIFT is in Belgium. It's not in the United States. And there could be a great deal of potential. I don't see it being the RMB because the capital markets are going to stay relatively closed. Obviously, at the end, Switzerland's too small. So, I mean, that would be a possible fallback. And so, you know, as the U.S. recedes, if Europe really did make a concerted effort of thinking of this as being in its interest, I think you could see a lot more, a much bigger increase in the share of the euro in foreign exchange reserves and in denominating transactions and things. At the same time as it becomes less and less that you're seeing dollars transacted. Would you macroeconomists, would you agree with that? Giorgio, what do you think?
All right. Well, I think the time has come to bring this fantastic discussion to an end. We knew the issue was complex. We knew it was multifaceted, and that therefore it will be, it was, and will remain difficult to foresee the consequences of what's been decided. But one thing comes out very clearly from this discussion, namely what happened last week was really a turning point, and it's bound to have lasting effects. We don't know which, by the way, but there are too many variables there. But it's one date that I think that will be remembered in the future, hopefully for good reasons and not only for bad reasons. And I will leave you on this touch of optimism that Nathalie kindly brought with her from Rome. Thank you all, and have a nice evening.
Do we have to keep calling it Liberation Day?